What if the most brutal architects of a genocidal regime, expecting only vengeance, instead encountered an astonishing act of humanity? What if the very people they were taught to despise offered them food and shelter, shattering a lifetime of ingrained hatred? This wasn't a hypothetical thought experiment in the desolate spring of 1945. It was a stark reality for captured SS female officers in the heart of a collapsing Nazi Germany. Imagine the chilling wind whipping through the skeletal remains of a bombed-out village near Magdeburg, the acrid smell of burnt timber still heavy in the air, as a column of weary American GIs, men of the U.S. First Army, rounded up their latest prisoners. Among them, several women in the notorious black uniforms of the SS, their faces etched with a fear born of propaganda, their eyes expecting the worst. In the next 40 minutes, we'll peel back the layers of this extraordinary encounter and reveal why it fundamentally reshaped the psychological battlefield of World War II and what it still teaches us today about the moral compass we navigate. By April 1945, Germany was a landscape of desolation. Cities like Cologne and Frankfurt lay in ruins, their civilian populations starving, their infrastructure obliterated. The Third Reich, once a monolith of terrifying power, was crumbling, its final days marked by a desperate, often senseless resistance. Yet even as the Allied armies pushed deeper, liberating concentration camps and exposing unspeakable atrocities, a profound and complex ethical dilemma emerged. The American military, having fought a brutal war across 2 continents, found itself confronting an enemy unlike any other. One driven by an ideology of absolute dehumanization, even for its own people. Within the vast machinery of the SS, women played a chillingly significant role, often serving as guards in concentration camps like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, or as auxiliary personnel in various administrative and support capacities. These were not just passive participants. Many were deeply indoctrinated, fervent believers in the Nazi narrative, convinced of Allied barbarity and the righteousness of their cause. Their training emphasized unwavering loyalty to the Führer, a rigid adherence to racial purity, and an absolute contempt for their enemies. They were taught that the Americans, the British, and the Soviets were little more than savage beasts, intent on the total annihilation of the German people. This propaganda was relentless, pervasive, and deeply effective, shaping their worldview down to its core. As American forces swept across the Rhine, encountering pockets of fanatical resistance alongside waves of surrendering soldiers and civilians, the sheer scale of the prisoner of war challenge became immense. By late April, more than 3 million German soldiers had been captured, their numbers swelling daily. Among them, a distinct group stood out. Female members of the SS, often found amidst the chaos of retreating units or attempting to blend in with civilian populations. Their capture presented a unique challenge, not just logistically, but morally. The American military, unlike the regime it was fighting, operated under a framework of rules, however imperfectly applied in the heat of battle. The Geneva Conventions, while technically not extending full prisoner of war status to SS personnel due to their criminal affiliations, still heavily influenced the conduct of U.S. forces. Imagine the scene: a makeshift processing center in a shell-scarred German town, perhaps near the Rhine, in early May 1945. The air is thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and despair. American soldiers, many of whom had witnessed the horrors of the camps firsthand, or fought through bloody urban combat, now stood guard over women in SS uniforms. These women, having been told their captors would torture and kill them, arrived expecting the worst. Their faces, hardened by war and ideology, betrayed a profound, primal fear. What would their first instinct be, knowing the atrocities their organization had committed? This was the crucible where theory met raw human instinct. American military doctrine, codified in manuals like the 1944 Soldier's Guide to Germany, emphasized discipline and adherence to a code of conduct, even towards a defeated enemy. This wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about upholding the very values that separated the Allies from the Axis. But applying these abstract rules to the architects of the Holocaust, especially those who embodied its most brutal elements, was an immense psychological burden. How could soldiers, trained to dehumanize the enemy in combat, suddenly pivot to a stance of humanitarian treatment towards those who had committed unspeakable acts, yet now stood disarmed and vulnerable? If you were an American soldier in that shattered landscape, facing an enemy indoctrinated in hate, what would your decision have been at that point? Let us know in the comments. Your perspective helps us understand the true weight of those moments. The dilemma was profound. American soldiers, many having just witnessed the horrors of concentration camps like Buchenwald or Dachau, were now tasked with treating their former enemies, including the very women who represented the SS's brutal core, according to a standard of conduct that their adversaries had utterly abandoned. This wasn't merely an administrative detail. It was a fundamental clash of ideologies, a moment where the United States Army's values were tested in the crucible of absolute victory. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself had issued directives emphasizing humane treatment for prisoners, recognizing that adherence to military ethics was a strategic imperative, not just a moral nicety. It underscored a crucial difference in military cultures, one driven by absolute ideology and brutality, the other by a framework of rules, even in the chaos of victory. Meanwhile, the SS women, steeped in years of Goebbels' relentless propaganda, fully anticipated retribution. They had been fed a diet of lies depicting Allied soldiers as barbaric invaders, eager to rape, pillage, and murder. Their training, particularly for those assigned to concentration camp duties or auxiliary roles within the SS Helferinnen Corps, hammered home a narrative of impending torture and summary execution should they fall into enemy hands. This deeply ingrained fear was not easily shaken. For them, surrender wasn't an act of relief, but a terrifying plunge into the unknown, a confirmation of the monstrous fate their leaders had promised. They believed they were entering a realm where all human decency had vanished, replaced by the savagery of their supposed oppressors. The sheer scale of the collapse exacerbated the challenge. By early May 1945, the Allied forces were managing millions of displaced persons, liberated slave laborers, and surrendering German troops. The logistical nightmare of feeding, sheltering, and processing such vast numbers was immense. Within this chaos, the captured female SS officers, though a smaller group, represented a potent symbolic challenge. They were often found with hidden weapons or attempting to destroy incriminating documents, their defiance lingering even in defeat. The American High Command understood but how these prisoners were treated, particularly those from the ideological core of the Nazi regime, would send a powerful message, not just to the Germans, but to the world. It was a subtle yet pervasive psychological operation unfolding in real time. The decision to adhere to Geneva Convention principles, even for those who might not technically qualify as conventional prisoners of war, was a deliberate strategic choice. It was an assertion of the very principles the Allies claimed to be fighting for. This was not about forgiveness or condoning their crimes, but about demonstrating a fundamental difference in values. The goal was to plant seeds of doubt, eroding the monolithic narrative of Allied barbarity that had sustained the German war effort for so long. The American military, through its actions, aimed to prove that the world they had been told existed by their Nazi leaders was a terrifying fabrication. But could such an approach truly penetrate the hardened shell of fanaticism? Consider the specific conditions. American forces established numerous provisional prisoner-of-war enclosures, often sprawling open-air camps or repurposed facilities across the Western Front. One such site, located just outside Remagen after the bridgehead was secured in March 1945, swelled with tens of thousands of German captives. Here, under the watchful eyes of American MPs, the routine of processing began. The SS women, frequently segregated from male prisoners, found themselves in crowded, often unsanitary, conditions, but within a framework of order. They were registered, their identities recorded, and their personal effects, where appropriate, catalogued. The expectation of immediate, brutal punishment hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that distorted every interaction. Then came the moment that challenged every fiber of their indoctrination. As dusk settled over one of these temporary enclosures, perhaps near the ruined industrial landscape of the Ruhr Valley in late April, American quartermaster units began distributing rations. The SS women, huddled together, watched with a mixture of suspicion and morbid curiosity. They had envisioned starvation, beatings, perhaps even summary executions. Instead, they observed GIs, many of whom were barely out of their teens, methodically handing out K-rations, small, prepackaged meals containing biscuits, canned meat, and sometimes even a stick of chewing gum or a few cigarettes. They were given blankets and directed to designated areas for shelter, rudimentary tents or sections of abandoned buildings. The simple act of receiving basic sustenance, of being treated as human beings, worthy of minimal care, was a profound, disorienting shock. It wasn't the lavish feast of a victor, but it was far, far removed from the savagery they had been promised. This quiet, unexpected adherence to ethical standards by the American military was about to have an effect that transcended the immediate moment, redefining the very nature of their defeat. The simple act of receiving basic sustenance, of being treated as human beings worthy of minimal care, was a profound, disorienting shock. It wasn't the lavish feast of a victor, but it was far, far removed from the savagery they had been promised. This quiet, unexpected adherence to ethical standards by the American military was about to have an effect that transcended the immediate moment, redefining the very nature of their defeat. For many of these SS women, the first taste of an American K-ration, a bland biscuit, a piece of processed cheese, perhaps a square of chocolate, was more than just sustenance. It was a bite out of their carefully constructed reality. Their leaders had relentlessly painted the Allies as subhuman monsters, incapable of such basic decency. Yet here, in the cold, damp spring of 1945, American GIs, men they were taught to despise, were methodically distributing rations, ensuring rudimentary shelter, and even providing medical attention for the sick and wounded among the captured. This wasn't a fleeting gesture. It was a consistent, systematic approach across the vast network of American-run prisoner enclosures, like those managed by the 12th Army Group in regions like the Rhine Meadow camps. The propaganda machine of Joseph Goebbels had worked for years to instill a deep-seated fear and hatred, particularly against the Western Allies. Newsreels and radio broadcasts had depicted American soldiers as undisciplined, racially impure, and driven by a desire for total destruction. The SS women, many of whom had served in roles that reinforced this hateful ideology, found themselves in a psychological battle. The tangible reality of their captivity, the lack of torture, the provision of basic necessities, the professional demeanor of their guards, began to chip away at the monolithic narrative they had internalized. It created a profound cognitive dissonance, a crack in the foundation of their worldview that was far more insidious than any physical punishment could have been. This wasn't an accident. The American command understood the power of psychological warfare. General Omar Bradley, leading the 12th Army Group, and other senior officers recognized that how they treated prisoners, especially those from the ideological core of the Nazi regime, would be a critical weapon in the final stages of the war and in the post-war occupation. The goal was not just to win the physical battle, but to win the ideological one, to demonstrate a stark contrast between the values of democracy and the brutality of totalitarianism. By upholding a code of conduct, even towards their most fanatical enemies, the Americans aimed to discredit Nazi propaganda and sow seeds of doubt among the German populace. Consider the sheer scale. By the time of Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, the Western Allies had taken millions of prisoners. Managing this human tide required immense discipline and a clear framework. The decision to treat SS personnel, even those implicated in war crimes, according to the spirit of the Geneva Conventions, was a strategic gambit. It meant allocating resources, food, water, medical supplies that were often scarce even for Allied troops. Yet, the leadership understood the long-term impact. This wasn't about being soft on the enemy. It was about demonstrating a fundamental difference in military ethics, a contrast that would resonate far beyond the barbed wire of the prison camps. The SS women themselves were a microcosm of this larger psychological struggle. Some remained defiant, clinging to their indoctrination, convinced that the Americans were merely lulling them into a false sense of security before unleashing their promised terror. Others, however, began to show signs of internal conflict. The consistent, if basic, humane treatment was a direct contradiction to everything they had been taught. It forced them to confront a terrifying possibility: that the world, as described by their beloved Führer and his propagandists, was a carefully constructed lie. This quiet unraveling of belief, often happening in the cramped, muddy confines of a temporary enclosure, was perhaps the most potent weapon in the Allied arsenal. But how deeply could such a subtle approach penetrate years of fanatical conviction? And what would it mean for the future of a shattered nation? The question wasn't if the approach was subtle, but if subtlety itself could pierce a mind forged in the crucible of totalitarian lies. For those SS female officers, the initial shock of receiving basic rations and shelter often gave way to a chilling internal calculation. They were trained to see weakness, to exploit any perceived vulnerability. So was this an elaborate trick? A sophisticated form of psychological torture designed to break them before the inevitable brutality? Or was it impossibly genuine? This profound uncertainty, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of fear, began to germinate in the quiet hours of captivity. Many of these women had served in the SS Gefolge, a collective term for female auxiliaries, or within the infamous Aufseherinnenkorps, overseeing concentration camps. Their roles, whether administrative at SS headquarters in Berlin or directly supervising prisoners at places like Bergen-Belsen, had reinforced a worldview where mercy was weakness and brutality was strength. Now, they were confronted with an inversion of those principles. American military policy, as articulated by the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or CHAFE, directives throughout April 1945, mandated that all prisoners, regardless of their affiliation, receive adequate food, water, and medical care. This wasn't merely a suggestion. It was a non-negotiable standard. The American soldiers, often young men from states like Ohio or Pennsylvania, found themselves in an unprecedented position. They had witnessed the horrors of war, the devastation of German cities, and the unspeakable suffering unearthed in liberated camps. Yet, they were tasked with upholding a standard of conduct that their enemy had long abandoned. in the makeshift processing facilities, perhaps a repurposed barn near the Elbe River in late April, the women were given not just K-rations, but also access to field hospitals for injuries or illness. Blankets were distributed, and efforts were made to separate them from male prisoners, a practical measure that also subtly communicated a degree of protective consideration. Each small act, devoid of fanfare, chipped away at the edifice of Nazi propaganda. This consistent adherence to ethical treatment wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate strategy, a silent declaration of values. The American command understood that the psychological impact of such acts could be more potent than any bomb. It aimed to create a stark, undeniable contrast. The Nazi regime promised a glorious future, but delivered starvation and terror, while the barbaric Allies, even in victory, adhered to a code of decency. The very act of providing a hot meal, a clean bandage, or a dry place to sleep became a weapon against the ideological armor of the SS, a direct challenge to the lies they had been fed for a decade. For some, the unraveling was slow, almost imperceptible. They would watch their American guards, observe their interactions, listen to their unthreatening commands, and compare it to the horrific scenarios painted by Goebbels. The images of savage, bloodthirsty invaders, intent on rape and destruction, simply did not align with the reality of GIs methodically counting out cigarettes or sharing a rare piece of chocolate. The discrepancy was jarring. This wasn't the heroic, defiant Germany their leaders had promised. This was a nation collapsing, its people desperate, and its ideological architects now reliant on the very enemy for their survival. The sheer weight of this cognitive burden, the forced reevaluation of deeply held beliefs, began to manifest in subtle ways. Whispers would start among the captured SS women, questions about the veracity of their own news, doubts about the ultimate fate of their leaders, and a growing, unsettling realization that perhaps, just perhaps, everything they believed was a fabrication. The systemic impact of such encounters, replicated across thousands of German prisoners, cannot be overstated. While it didn't instantly dismantle every SS officer's ingrained beliefs, it planted seeds of doubt, eroding the monolithic narrative of Allied barbarity. For many, it marked the beginning of a profound disillusionment, a realization that the world they had been told existed was a terrifying fabrication. This quiet, unexpected adherence to ethical standards by the American military had a subtle yet pervasive effect on the final weeks of the war, perhaps contributing to the eventual collapse of morale and resistance. It underscored a crucial difference in military cultures, one driven by absolute ideology and brutality, the other by a framework of rules, even in the chaos of victory. These moments, often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, began to reveal profound truths about the nature of war, the power of ideology, and the enduring strength of human decency. The question remained, what would this fundamental shift in perception mean for the post-war landscape, and how would these women, once so sure of their cause, reconcile their past with this new, unsettling reality? The question wasn't simply about survival anymore. It was about identity. For many of these SS women, the slow, methodical provision of care by their American captors initiated a profound internal crisis. Their entire worldview, carefully constructed over years of indoctrination, was predicated on the absolute evil of the enemy. Now, faced with the tangible reality of a K-ration, a clean blanket, or a medic's gentle hand, the carefully erected walls of Nazi propaganda began to crumble, not with a bang, but with a disorienting whisper. What happens when the enemy you've been taught to despise is subhuman, instead offers you a basic courtesy? This wasn't a universal epiphany. Of course, some remained hardened, their fanaticism a shield against the unsettling truth. But for others, the consistent adherence to a code of conduct by American personnel, often young men from the U.S. Ninth Army, who had endured months of brutal fighting, forced an agonizing reevaluation. Goebbels's pervasive narrative of Allied barbarity, of invaders intent on rape and destruction, simply did not align with the professional, if stern, demeanor of the GIs guarding them in makeshift camps near cities like Leipzig in late April 1945. The discrepancy was jarring, creating a deep cognitive dissonance that gnawed at the foundations of their belief. They had been prepared for anything but decency. And the American soldiers themselves? This wasn't an easy task. Many had witnessed firsthand the unspeakable atrocities committed by the SS, or fought through the devastation left in their wake. The visceral anger and trauma of combat, the images of liberated concentration camps, were fresh in their minds. Yet they were under strict orders to uphold the Geneva Conventions, even for those who might not technically qualify as conventional prisoners of war due to their SS affiliation. General George S. Patton, known for his stern discipline, had issued clear directives emphasizing the humane treatment of prisoners, understanding that maintaining military ethics was paramount, even when facing an enemy who had none. This required immense self-control and a commitment to principles that transcended personal vengeance. This commitment wasn't left to individual discretion. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, under General Eisenhower, had established detailed protocols for prisoner processing and welfare. This systematic approach, applied across dozens of provisional prisoner of war enclosures, demonstrated a stark contrast to the SS's own brutal, dehumanizing methods. It was a silent yet powerful assertion of the very values the Allies claimed to be fighting for. The strategic goal extended beyond immediate compliance. The American command understood that how they treated these prisoners, particularly those from the ideological core of the Nazi regime, would be a critical component of psychological warfare. It was designed to accelerate the collapse of German morale, encourage further surrenders, and lay the groundwork for a post-war re-education that would be essential for a stable Europe. By discrediting Nazi propaganda through undeniable acts of decency, the Allies aimed to dismantle the enemy's will to fight from within. Could this soft power truly dismantle the fanaticism that had gripped a nation for over a decade? For the SS women, the unraveling was often a quiet, internal process. They would observe their American guards, noting their routine, their lack of overt cruelty, the absence of the torture their leaders had promised. They listened to the hushed conversations among themselves, the subtle shifts in tone as some began to question the ultimate fate of their leaders, or the veracity of their own news. The images of savage, bloodthirsty invaders, intent on rape and destruction, simply did not align with the reality of GIs methodically counting out cigarettes or sharing a rare piece of chocolate. The discrepancy was profoundly unsettling. This quiet subversion of ideology wasn't confined to the prison camps. Rumors of humane treatment, even for SS personnel, began to filter out to the wider German population. As the Reich crumbled and its propaganda machine faltered, these whispers undermined the regime's desperate calls for a final, fanatical resistance. The Nazi narrative of Endkampf, a glorious final struggle against barbaric invaders, clashed violently with the reality of orderly surrender and, critically, the unexpected human decency shown by the victors. It forced civilians and soldiers alike to question everything they had been told. The significance of these moments, often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, cannot be overstated. This wasn't about converting them instantly to democratic ideals, but about initiating a fundamental process of denazification, breaking the propaganda barrier that had isolated a nation. The immediate impact was the planting of seeds of doubt, eroding the monolithic narrative of Allied barbarity. The true test, however, would come not in the confines of captivity, but in the aftermath, when these women, once so sure of their cause, were eventually released back into a shattered society, tasked with reconciling their past with this new, unsettling reality. This wasn't merely a shift in circumstance. It was a profound inversion of reality, a conceptual earthquake for those SS female officers. The enemy, depicted for years as subhuman, rapacious, and utterly devoid of mercy, was instead providing the very essentials for survival: food, water, and shelter. This wasn't a random act of kindness, but a systematic application of military ethics, a policy meticulously implemented by the American forces. The initial shock of receiving a K-ration or being directed to a rudimentary but dry sleeping area morphed into a far more unsettling realization. The entire foundation of their belief system was being challenged, not by force, but by unexpected decency. For many, this was the moment the ideological armor began to crack. Imagine a solid, impenetrable wall, built layer by layer over a decade of propaganda, suddenly showing hairline fractures from within. The Nazi regime's narrative, hammered home through every broadcast and every directive from Berlin, painted a stark binary world: the virtuous Aryan race against the barbaric, destructive Allies. Yet here, in the muddy, makeshift camps of vanquished Germany, the barbaric Americans were adhering to a code of conduct that the virtuous SS had long abandoned. This wasn't just contradictory, it was an existential threat to their ingrained worldview. The consistency of this approach was the key. By early May 1945, as Germany capitulated, the Western Allies had taken over 3 million German prisoners. The sheer logistical and ethical challenge of managing such a colossal number meant that humane treatment, codified in directives from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, had to be standardized. It wasn't a choice left to individual GIs' whims. It was a non-negotiable command. This systematic adherence, even when faced with the architects of unspeakable horrors, became the most potent psychological weapon. It wasn't about converting them to democracy overnight, but about planting an undeniable seed of doubt, shattering the illusion of Allied barbarity that infueled their fanaticism. Hold this detail for a second, because it redefines everything that follows. This wasn't just a moral stance, it was a calculated strategic move. The American High Command understood that the post-war reconstruction of Germany, and indeed Europe, depended on dismantling the Nazi ideology at its core. By demonstrating a fundamental difference in values, even towards those who had committed the most heinous acts, they aimed to discredit the entire Nazi narrative. It was a subtle form of re-education, starting in the very first moments of captivity. The act of providing a basic meal, a clean bandage from a field medic, or a blanket on a cold night became a silent yet powerful declaration of principles. It proved that the world their leaders had described, one where their enemies were monsters, was a terrifying fabrication. The psychological impact on the SS women was profound. They had been taught to expect torture, starvation, and summary execution. Instead, they received a consistent, if austere, level of care. They observed the discipline of their American guards, the orderly processing of prisoners, the absence of the vengeful savagery they had been promised. This discrepancy created a profound cognitive dissonance, forcing them to reconcile the propaganda with the tangible reality. For many, it marked the beginning of a deep disillusionment, an agonizing process of questioning everything they had believed. It wasn't an instant conversion, but a slow, corrosive erosion of certainty. Even for those who clung fiercely to their fanaticism, convinced this was merely a deceptive ploy, the seed of doubt was irrevocably planted. The contrast was too stark, the consistency too undeniable. The narrative of Allied barbarity could not stand against the reality of a shared cigarette, a medic tending to a wound, or the simple act of receiving a measured ration. This quiet, unexpected adherence to ethical standards by the American military had a subtle yet pervasive effect on the final weeks of the war, perhaps contributing to the eventual collapse of morale and resistance. It underscored a crucial difference in military cultures, one driven by absolute ideology and brutality, the other by a framework of rules, even in the chaos of victory. But how would this deep-seated ideological wound heal or fester in the years to come? The answers to that question, about healing or festering, would unfold over years, not days. For many of these captured SS female officers, the immediate aftermath of war was a bewildering landscape of shattered certainties. The initial shock of American decency, rather than outright vengeance, did not instantly convert them into proponents of democracy. Instead, it often triggered a profound internal conflict, a battle between deeply ingrained propaganda and undeniable lived experience. This wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a slow, painful process, grinding process of cognitive dissonance, a relentless pressure on the foundations of their belief. Consider the psychological weight of such a contradiction. For years, they had been told the Allies were subhuman, barbaric, intent on the complete annihilation of Germany and its people. Yet, in the spring of 1945, as they sat in hastily constructed enclosures, perhaps a former Luftwaffe barracks now repurposed near Rheinberg, they were being fed, clothed, and even given medical attention by these very monsters. This wasn't merely a factual inconsistency. It was an assault on their entire moral and political framework. The carefully constructed world of Nazi ideology, which had defined their purpose and identity, was crumbling not under a hail of bullets, but under the quiet, persistent pressure of human decency. This systematic approach to prisoner welfare was no accident. The American military leadership, particularly those involved in planning the post-war occupation, understood that the treatment of German prisoners would be a critical first step in the long, arduous process of denazification. General Lucius D. Clay, who would become deputy military governor, recognized that winning the peace required more than just military victory. It demanded a fundamental shift in German consciousness. The humane treatment of even SS personnel then served a dual purpose, upholding ethical military standards and strategically undermining the very fabric of Nazi propaganda. It was a silent, yet powerful, testament to a different way of being, a stark contrast to the brutality they had just escaped. The subtle acts of care, meticulously documented in reports from the Provost Marshal General's office, went beyond mere sustenance. Access to clean water, rudimentary sanitation, and even the allowance of personal hygiene items, however basic, chipped away at the dehumanizing narratives. These small details, often overlooked in grand histories of conflict, were crucial. They communicated a respect for basic human dignity that the SS system had utterly obliterated. For women who had been trained to view themselves as part of a superior race and their enemies as vermin, receiving such consideration from the enemy was not just disorienting, it was an act of profound, if quiet, subversion against their own indoctrination. This wasn't about forgiveness, it was about strategic reality. The sheer scale of the Allied victory, with millions of Germans surrendering, meant that a policy of indiscriminate brutality would have been logistically impossible and morally ruinous. By adhering to international conventions and a higher ethical standard, the Americans were not only distinguishing themselves from the defeated regime, but also laying the moral groundwork for future reconciliation. The message was clear. There was a difference between fighting an enemy and descending to their level of barbarity. This distinction, often lost in the chaos of war, was now being demonstrated in the most direct, personal way possible. The long-term effects of these early encounters were varied and complex. For some, the unwavering decency of their captors eventually broke through their ideological defenses, leading to a slow, painful reevaluation of their past. For others, the cognitive dissonance festered, manifesting as a deep-seated denial or a stubborn refusal to accept the truth of their defeat and the crimes of their regime. But even for the most fanatical, the undeniable reality of American conduct planted a seed of doubt, a nagging question that would linger for years. If the enemy was truly so evil, why did they treat us with such unexpected humanity? This question, repeated across thousands of individual experiences, began to subtly reshape the collective memory of a nation. It was a crucial first step, a foundational crack in the monolithic wall of Nazi lies. Yet the full implications of this quiet revolution would only become clear much later. The immediate post-war years in Germany were a crucible, not just of physical reconstruction, but of profound psychological reorientation. For the thousands of captured SS female officers, the journey back into a shattered society was fraught with a unique tension. They carried with them not only the stigma of their affiliation, but also the unsettling memory of American decency. Cities like Cologne and Frankfurt lay in ruins, their civilian population starving. Yet the occupiers, the supposed barbarians, had provided them with rations and shelter. This contradiction, this gaping chasm between indoctrination and experience, became a persistent, nagging presence. The process of denazification, initiated by the Allied occupation forces, was a monumental undertaking. It began not in lecture halls, but in the processing centers and temporary internment camps where these women were held. The American military, under directives from the Office of Military Government for Germany, United States, or OMGU, understood that merely defeating the enemy militarily was insufficient. The ideological war had to be won too. This meant a systematic effort to expose the lies of the Nazi regime, often starting with personal testimonies and the undeniable evidence of their own humane treatment, contrasting with the regime's brutality. The initial shock of unexpected kindness had opened a door. Now the challenge was to walk through it. Many of these women were released into a German society grappling with collective guilt, denial, and immense practical hardship. They faced suspicion from their own countrymen, who had also endured the war, and the omnipresent scrutiny of Allied authorities. The internal battle between the deeply ingrained Nazi worldview and the undeniable reality of their captivity continued. Some clung to their old beliefs, dismissing the humane treatment as a clever trick, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. Yet, for many others, the consistent ethical conduct of the American GIs had irrevocably fractured their certainty. The image of the monstrous enemy, once so vivid, had been replaced by the memory of a young American soldier sharing a cigarette, or a medic carefully bandaging a wound. This wasn't about instant conversion. It was about the slow, agonizing erosion of a fabricated reality. The contrast wasn't just theoretical, it was lived experience. They had been told the Allies were coming to enslave them, to destroy their culture, to enact vengeance for every German transgression. Instead, they encountered an occupying force that, while firm, adhered to a code of conduct that distinguished between combatants and those in their care. This adherence, often difficult for soldiers who had witnessed unimaginable horrors, was a deliberate strategic choice, a testament to the belief that military ethics could be a more potent long-term force than any propaganda. The psychological landscape of post-war Germany was a mosaic of shattered illusions and nascent doubts. For these former SS female officers, the process of reconciling their past with their present was often a solitary, painful journey. They saw their former leaders discredited, their symbols of power reduced to rubble, and the grand promises of the Thousand-Year Reich exposed as a catastrophic lie. The quiet acts of decency from their American captors, once a disorienting anomaly, now stood as a stark counter-narrative to everything they had been taught. It forced them to confront not just the defeat of their nation, but the moral bankruptcy of the ideology they had served. This shift, however subtle, had profound implications for the nascent efforts to rebuild Germany. It meant that initial encounters with the victors were not always characterized by hatred and fear, but sometimes by a disorienting sense of gratitude and confusion. This created a fragile yet essential opening for the re-education programs that followed. Programs designed to instill democratic values and confront the crimes of the past. The unexpected human touch in the camps became a foundational, if unacknowledged, element in the long, arduous path towards a different Germany. It begged the question, if such entrenched fanaticism could be challenged by simple decency, what broader lessons did this hold for the nature of conflict itself and for the choices leaders make in its aftermath? The question of whether entrenched fanaticism could be challenged by simple decency holds profound answers for the nature of conflict itself and for the choices leaders make in its aftermath. These quiet, unexpected moments, where SS female officers received rations and shelter instead of the anticipated vengeance, weren't just isolated acts of kindness. They were strategic interventions, a consistent demonstration of principles that aim to dismantle an ideology not just through force, but through a stark, undeniable contrast. The systemic impact of such encounters, replicated across thousands of German prisoners, cannot be overstated. While it didn't instantly dismantle every SS officer's ingrained beliefs, it planted seeds of doubt, eroding the monolithic narrative of Allied barbarity. For many, it marked the beginning of a profound disillusionment, a realization that the world they had been told existed was a terrifying fabrication. This quiet, unexpected adherence to ethical standards by the American military had a subtle yet pervasive effect on the final weeks of the war, perhaps contributing to the eventual collapse of morale and resistance. It underscored a crucial difference in military cultures, one driven by absolute ideology and brutality, the other by a framework of rules, even in the chaos of victory. This wasn't just about winning a war. It was about defining the peace that followed. These moments, often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, reveal profound truths about the nature of war, the power of ideology, and the enduring strength of human decency. They challenge us to look beyond the headlines and grand narratives into the quiet, often uncomfortable, spaces where human beings, once enemies, confront each other without the lens of propaganda. It's a story that compels us to consider the burden of leadership, the moral choices made under unimaginable pressure, and the lasting legacy of those decisions. This isn't just a historical anecdote. It's a testament to the enduring power of principles, the American commitment to a code of conduct, even towards those who served a brutal regime, fundamentally reshaped the psychological battlefield, demonstrating that military ethics, consistently applied, can be a more potent force than propaganda in the crucible of conflict. If this deep dive into the unexpected made sense to you, subscribe now to WW2 Beyond Battles so you don't miss the next chapter. Leave a like so I know it's worth continuing down this path of untold stories, and comment which part of this journey turned the key for you. I'll be reading those ideas for what comes next. And what if I showed you the untold story of Japanese women warriors who defied expectations, completing this narrative of overlooked courage?